This is the third video about the class competition task that we are working on. In the first video, we learned about how to navigate the data set using the command and arrow keys, or the shift and arrow keys to highlight data sets, and combining these ideas together, command and shift, holding both of those down, and using one keystroke to highlight the whole data set. Now, in the second video, we computed the mean, the median, and the mode. And we didn't do that using our calculators or a piece of paper and pencil, but instead, we entered a formula. We used the average formula in order to have the spreadsheet calculate the average of everything from A2 to A29. This is box A2. And then down here is box A29. So that's what's happening in this box. The arithmetic average, or the mean of this data, is 80.32. We also computed the median of the data set and the mode of the data set. These are three measurements of what we call central tendency. They describe really the middle of the data set. Today, in this video, we want to try to understand how spread out the data is. And there's a lot of different ways that we can describe that. But in this video, I'm going to just describe several different calculations that we can do that sort of hint at how spread out or condensed this data is. And the first thing that we might be interested in is the minimum value in the data set. Of course, like you saw in the first video, I could sort this data and find the minimum, but I also have a formula, and I will tell the spreadsheet with the equal sign, hey, I'm about to enter a formula. You should evaluate this formula and then put the result in this box. So I want to do the minimum, and notice there's the autocomplete gives me min as my option, and then it prompts me for, hey, what numbers, what data set do you want to look at? And I'm going to highlight that whole data set, close my parentheses, and there it is. The minimum of this data set is 46. So that tells us a little bit about how low the scores go, which is the minimum is very much related to how the data is spread out. The maximum, we can also find that using, as I'm sure you may have guessed, the max formula. So here I'm going to find the maximum of this data set, and it's 94. So immediately we can see that the scores in the geometry class range pretty expansively from a 46 to a 94. I can use these two numbers to describe a third number, the range of the data, which I'm going to use a formula to do this. I'm just going to take this maximum, which is in box D6, and subtract the minimum, which is in D5. And the spreadsheet does a lot to help you understand what values or what inputs there are to the formula that you're calculating. You see the orange and the purple. And that's all I need to do in order to calculate the range. There it is. So from 46 to 94, that's a 48-point range. That also is an indication of the spread of this data. So again, mean, median, mode, that's our central tendency. Minimum, maximum, range, these are ways, these give us an idea of how spread out the data is. And there's a few more that we want to think about in order to have a complete picture of how this data is spread out or not spread out. And before we get into this next formula, I just want to introduce you to the idea of quartiles. And what that is certainly sounds a lot like quarters, and that's basically what it is. If I sort this data from least to greatest, and I divide it into 4 equal collections of data points, each one of those represents a quartile. So the first quartile starts at 46, the minimum, and goes up so that it contains 1/4 of the data points. And then that's the first quartile. And so I'm going to calculate that right here. I want to know what is the first quartile of this data set. Where does that first quartile end? And again, I have a quartile function. And notice there's a little difference here. We're not just telling the quartile function the data that we want to use. I'll do that first of all. Okay, there it is. And then I'm going to put a comma instead of closing my parentheses because there's another piece of information I have to give the quartile function. I need to tell it which quartile do I want. Well, I don't want the third quartile. I want the first quartile. Tell me, spreadsheet, where does the first quartile end? And it says here 76.75. So from 46, the minimum, up until 76.75, all the scores that are in that represent the lowest quarter of scores in this data set. Okay, and just to maybe you've already figured this out, but if you find the second quartile of this data set, oops, let me get my comma in there. If I want to find the second quartile of this data set, notice it's 83. It's actually just the median. So the second quartile is really just the median. So we don't really we don't call it the second quartile, we call it the median, even though it represents the second quartile. What it really means is half of the scores are below this number and half of them are above. But we're going to compute the first quartile and the third quartile. Third quartile, here it is. Okay, and so what this means here, the third quartile is basically if you scored an 86 or better on this quiz, then you're in the top quarter of the class. That's what this third quartile means. And the last thing that we're going to do, and one of the things that we tend to do with the first and the third quartile is we take the difference between them. So I will take the third quartile and subtract the first quartile, and I get this. It's like a 10-point range, and that is called the interquartile range, or IQR they call it sometimes. The interquartile range is also a very important metric of spread, or how spread out the data is. So the middle 50% of this data, the middle half, falls between this first quartile and this third quartile. So the middle of this range, or 50% of the scores in this data set fall within 10 points of each other. And so that's another way to think about how the data is spread out. So again, mean, median, mode, those represent the central tendency of the data. 3 different ways of thinking about and looking at the central tendency. Minimum and maximum combine to make the range, and then the first and third quartiles combine to make the interquartile range. These are ways of considering how spread out the data is. And that's another thing that we are interested in when we're analyzing statistical information.